I didn't cry at my husband's funeral. I laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. Don't get me wrong. It was a dry little chuckle that slipped out on its own when I saw who was carrying the biggest wreath, the one that said in golden letters, "To our dear friend, an example of honesty." The man carrying it was the bank manager, the one my late husband had been playing poker and commissions with for years. A man so slippery that if you hug him, you end up stuck to the moral tar he oozes. And there he was, in impeccable black, with a solemn face, as if someone had ripped his heart out too. I looked at him from the church pew, with that smell of wilted flowers and cheap candles glued to my nose, and I thought, look at that. In the end, more people are going to show up to say goodbye to his pension than to say goodbye to him. And that laugh, small but proud, slipped out, and the lady next to me nudged me with her elbow as if laughing at a funeral were worse than putting up with 40 years of lies. My daughter Lucy, who is always late to everything, came in right in the middle of the prayer, hair messy, phone in hand, and face red from having run from work. She sat next to me, squeezed my arm and whispered, "Mum, I'm sorry. The metro was impossible." "Don't worry," I told her without looking at her. "He's not going anywhere from there." The truth is, my husband was waked more out of habit than affection. The neighbors came, gave 2 kisses, told the same anecdote as always, those made-up stories about how honest he was, how he helped everyone. And then they went to the door to smoke and comment on whether the coffee was watered down. I watched them walk by as if they were extras in a cheap TV show, each with their role, each saying their line, and me sitting there, in a black dress that was too tight at the waist, thinking very un-Catholic thoughts for that moment. Mass ended. The priest talked about eternal life in such a monotonous voice that, if he'd had God in front of him, he would have fallen asleep. And we went to the cemetery, that sad parade of umbrellas, even though it wasn't raining. Because in this country, if you don't whip out an umbrella at a funeral, it looks like you're not suffering enough. When everything was over, when they'd already thrown the shovelfuls of dirt and the neighbors started looking at their watches because they were going to be late for the afternoon soap opera, the bank manager came over to me, hand on his chest, as if he were about to declare his love. "Evelyn, I'm truly sorry. He was an exceptional man," he said, with those eyes that don't get wet even with drops. "Yeah, right," I replied, "exceptionally yours, from what I can see." He didn't get the joke, or pretended not to, and gave me a soft pat on the shoulder, one of those you give without really touching the other person, so the pain doesn't rub off on you. And off he went, the way he'd come in, calculating. We came back home at the end of the afternoon, with that gray, bad movie sky. And the first thing I did wasn't cry, or sit down to reminisce, or any of that stuff they put in perfume adverts for widows. The first thing I did was take off my shoes, because my feet were raw. And the second was look for the folder of papers the lawyer had left on the living room table, with that hidden smoker smell he had, like he'd smoked a cigarette over every document. Lucy went into the kitchen to make coffee, because in this country, everything is fixed with coffee, even death. And from there, she kept shouting, "Mum, we have to talk about the flat, okay? You can't stay here alone, in such a big house, with the stairs, with everything. Let me bury your father first, love, then we'll bury the rest," I answered, without taking my eyes off the papers. There were receipts from the funeral home, flower invoices, bank statements, and among them, a bill with the elegant logo of a law firm, Sullivan and Associates, Widows Pension Management. I picked it up, held it up to the light as if it were a work of art, and felt something off, a figure that didn't make sense to me, an amount too large for a simple procedure. Fees, €1,850. I froze, that amount stamped on my forehead, not because I didn't know that everyone charges for everything, but because I myself had heard my husband say, not once but several times, that for these things, Social Security has its own procedure, no need for a lawyer for silly stuff. And yet, there it was, a lawyer better paid than a surgeon. "Lucy," I called from the living room, "did you know anything about this?" She stuck her head through the doorway, cup in hand and dark circles under her eyes. "About what?" I handed her the bill. She looked at it for a second, frowned and blurted out, "Well, Mum, you know what Dad was like. He did everything big. Maybe he thought they'd sort it out faster this way. Yeah, big for him, small for me, I muttered. And here I'm going to pause, because I'm going to confess something. At that moment, I still didn't know half of what was coming. I only saw a strange paper, and a strange smell, and a strange life that suddenly felt very quiet. But what came afterwards was something else. It was a kind of earthquake with hair rollers, big handbags, and little sachets of chamomile tea. An earthquake of angry widows that, I promise you, never makes it onto the evening news. Before I go on with my story, I'm very curious to know from where in the world and at what time you're joining me today. I'd love to read you in the comments. Because I'm going to tell you the truth as it happened, without frills, and I want to picture your face, wherever you are, when we get to certain points where I myself had to sit down so I wouldn't fall backwards. That night, when Lucy left, she left early, as always, with the excuse that she had work the next day. The house fell into a very strange silence. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of when someone has lied for a long time, and you start to hear the echo of all those lies crashing into each other. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the dining table with the folder in front of me, and went back to the lawyer's bill. Sullivan and Associates, I repeated out loud. The name sounded like one of those surnames you see in adverts for expensive deodorants. Then I remembered Teresa. Teresa was that typical friend who finds out everything before anyone else, the one who knows who's divorced, who's mortgaged, who's run off with the postman, and who's come back with the gas man. And, besides, barely 2 months earlier she'd buried her husband, another one of those exemplary men from my late husband's generation. I picked up the landline, yes, landline, because I'm one of those who believes that if something rings loud, it's more real, and called her. Yes, she answered with a late-night radio show voice. It's me, Teresa. Did they charge you a kidney for your widow's pension? Silence. Then a long sigh. Oh, Evelyn, here we go. What have you seen? A lawyer's bill, almost 2,000 euros for clicking a mouse. Then we've got the same lawyer, love, she said, and I could hear the tremor in her voice. They charged me about the same. I felt as if someone had switched on a torch in a dark room. Who recommended him to you? I asked. Your husband. That sentence hit me like a brick. My own husband, mine, the one who said, I'll handle the paperwork, you don't worry, had sent Teresa to the same firm. Tomorrow, 3:30, at Manny's bar, I said. You, me, and every paper you've got. Are we in mourning or at war, Evelyn? Both, Teresa, both. I hung up with my heart racing, more than at the funeral, more than with the priest, more than with the bank. Because it's one thing for life to take your husband away, and a very different thing for it to take your dignity and your pension as a bonus. I stayed a long while looking at the table, the papers, the dirty coffee cup Lucy had left, my husband's empty ashtray that was never going to fill up again. And something very strange happened to me. I didn't feel grief. I felt curiosity. I wanted to know how much, why, since when, with whom. And I swear it wasn't rage. Rage came later, further down the line, when we started to uncover names and figures and accounts in places where I didn't even know there were banks. In that first moment, what I felt was something women my age are not allowed to feel. The urge to stick your nose where nobody wants you to. I put the bill in my handbag, that big handbag where half the house fits, and, from that day on, half the case, and I got up with one fixed idea in my head. If there was something dirty, I was going to find it. And if my husband had anything to do with it, that too. And that's how, without knowing it, while I was switching off the dining room light and leaving my shoes strewn along the hallway, the story of the Furious Widows Club really began. Not in the church, or in the cemetery, or in the funeral home, but at a table full of papers, with a bill that didn't add up and an appointment for the next day, at 3:30, in the usual bar, where misfortunes taste a little less bitter if you have them with sugar and shared bad temper. At 3:30 on the dot, I got to Manny's bar with my handbag hanging off my arm and the lawyer's bill tucked between the tissues, the recipe notebook, and my purse. The bar smelled of reheated coffee and fried squid. The TV in the back was shouting about some crime show, and at the counter 2 pensioners were arguing about politics as if they were ministers. Teresa was already there, sitting at our usual table, still wearing her coat and with her hands clasped over her bag as if she were praying silently that I was wrong. She greeted me with a sad smile, one of those that can't stay up even with pins. And right then Carol arrived, puffing, scarf dangling, cigarette unlit between her fingers. "I had to rush because the police stopped me to tell me you can't smoke in the street," she said as she sat down. "But the worst part is, they were right." And behind her appeared Martha, always elegant, with that air of retired teacher who still combs her hair to give class, carrying a folder full of papers and her lips painted red. The 4 of us looked at each other for a long second, with that mix of respect and fear you feel when you know you're equal in misfortune, and I was the first to speak. "I want you to tell me how much they charged you for the pension stuff." Teresa pulled out a crumpled envelope. Carol rummaged in her bag until she found a grease-stained slip. Martha laid out a perfectly folded sheet. I put them all on the table, side by side, and there were the names. Sullivan and Associates, the same amounts, the same signatures. "This can't be a coincidence," I said, and I felt my throat tighten as I said it. Carol lit the contraband cigarette she always carried in her bag and exhaled the smoke with the satisfaction of someone casting a curse. "Not coincidence, love. This is a scam in capital letters." Martha leaned forward, lowered her voice, and with that calm of people who've seen too much, added, "And it's not just us. My neighbor on the 5th floor, the one with the cat called Pluto, she also went to the same firm. She says they made her sign a power of attorney to speed up the process." The sentence floated in the air, heavy, power of attorney. In those 2 words, there was more danger than on an icy highway. "And did you sign something like that?" I asked her. "No," said Martha, "but Teresa did." Teresa lowered her gaze, her eyes filled with water, and, she murmured, "I signed it without reading, Evelyn. I was so nervous that day I signed everything they put in front of me." And there, for the first time, I felt something like responsibility, as if it wasn't enough to uncover the scam, as if I had to do something for the 3 of them, for all of us. "Then we're going to read it now, and we're going to understand it, and if it's a scam, that Sullivan is going to have to look us in the eye," I said firmly. And even Carol put out her cigarette, something she only did at funerals or in the doctor's office. I called Manny over with a gesture. "What'll it be today, girls?" he asked us in his usual tone, that mix between fatherly and nosy. "4 strong coffees, Manny? We're coming from a moral funeral," I answered, and he laughed without understanding, because men don't understand these small wars we fight in paperwork. While we were talking, Martha pulled a sealed white envelope from her folder. "My husband left me this before he died. He told me to keep it just in case," she explained. We opened it carefully, like someone opening a box of snakes. Inside, there was a copy of a bill just like ours, and at the bottom, a pencil note. "Phantom client, ID, doesn't exist." We stared without breathing. A non-existent client cashing a real pension. Carol was the first to break the silence. "So they're not just thieves, they're poets. They invent dead people and make them collect. Don't you see? This Sullivan and his gang are forging identities." Outside, the sky was starting to cloud over, and the noise from the street slipped through the door like a distant murmur. I suddenly felt that this wasn't just bored widows' gossip, that there was something big behind it, something ugly and organized, and that if we didn't stop it, no one would. "We have to go to that firm," I said. "To do what?" Teresa asked, trembling a little. "To look them in the eye, ask questions, see how their faces twitch when we tell them we know they're inventing dead people." Martha nodded. Carol muttered, "I'll bring the notebook." And Teresa, though pale as the wall, pressed her lips together and said, "If I don't do it now, I'll never do it." And so, between cold coffees and words that you can't take back, we sealed our invisible pact. We didn't shake hands or make movie promises. We just stayed quiet for a few seconds. And in that silence, I realized we were no longer just 4 women with bills, but something else. A kind of front made of old anger, exhausted patience, and self-respect. When we got up to leave, Manny shouted from behind the counter. "Do I put this on your tab?" And Carol replied, "Put it on Sullivan. He pays for everything lately." We laughed, but the laugh sounded different. It wasn't light. It was the laugh of someone getting ready to do something they shouldn't. At the door, Teresa took my arm and whispered, in my ear, "Evelyn, if I don't answer the phone tomorrow, don't call the police, call Carol." "Why?" I asked, and she replied, "Because Carol doesn't ask questions, she acts." I looked at her, and for a moment I felt a strange tenderness. That mix of fear and admiration you feel when you see a woman decide to stop bowing her head. We said goodbye, each towards one side of the neighborhood, and as I walked, I felt the weight of the handbag on my arm, as if I were carrying a loaded weapon inside. I ran into the bank manager at the corner. He greeted me with that polite smile that no longer fooled me, and I nodded back without stopping. As I climbed the stairs to my building, I knew there'd be no turning back, that this bill had opened a door that wasn't going to shut easily. On the landing, I ran into Harold, my neighbor, the retired accountant who knows more about numbers than the tax office. "I saw you in the bar, Evelyn, with the girls. What are you, plotting?" he asked with half a smile. "Nothing serious," I said. "Just an accounting revenge." He laughed, patted my shoulder and said, "Then count me in." And just like that, without planning it, without yet understanding the size of the mess, the club began to grow, to take shape, to become real. We didn't need a name, but we already had one. We were widows, and we were furious. That night there was no sleep or rest. I sat staring at the landline, waiting for I don't know what call, with the feeling that someone else was watching us. And while the old hallway clock struck 11:30 with its tired chime, I felt that, for the first time in a long time, I had something to go out of the house for the next day. The next morning, when the street still smelled of fresh bread and early morning rubbish, I called Carol. She didn't even let me greet her. She answered with her raspy, half-asleep voice. "So when are we going to the firm, General?" I told her that, same afternoon, that if we waited any longer, our doubts would rust. Martha showed up on time like a procession, and Teresa arrived last, in a coat that was too big on her and a cough I didn't like at all. We walked together to the center, 4 women in black, crossing the market as if we were going to a funeral where we still didn't know who the dead person was. Sullivan's office was in a light stone building with a revolving door that seemed designed to make people dizzy before they went in. Inside, it smelled of expensive perfume and freshly ground coffee, and the walls were lined with diplomas and framed photos with politicians and judges. A young receptionist, with a manufactured smile and perfect nails, looked at us as if a senior's coach trip had slipped into her lobby. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No, we're in a hurry," Carol replied, dropping her bag on the counter with a thud that made the pens tremble. The girl hesitated, but Carol's tone was the kind that doesn't allow for protocols, so she showed us into a waiting room with black leather armchairs and a water dispenser that sighed as it worked. On the wall, a photo of Sullivan shaking hands with a minister, both smiling with that expression of people who never pay their own taxes. Teresa fidgeted in the armchair. Martha examined the paintings with the curiosity of someone studying a crime scene, and I thought about the bill's amount, about Teresa's voice saying, "I signed it without reading," and about everything that could go wrong if we opened our mouths too soon. Sullivan appeared suddenly, like something out of a TV show. Dark suit, discreet tie, polished smile. He greeted us as if we were old friends. "Ladies, what an honor to have you here. My deepest condolences for your loss. How can I help you?" I laid the bills out for him, one by one, on his gleaming glass desk that reflected our faces like a mirror. "We want to understand why we all paid the same for services that were supposedly different," I said firmly, and I felt the other 3 hold their breath. He looked at them without blinking, picked up the first one, skimmed it, and let out a little laugh, as if he'd just heard a bad joke. "Ah, yes, the firm's standard fees. Normal procedure, ladies, everything absolutely legal." "Even the clients who don't exist?" Martha asked, and the silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a spoon. Sullivan raised his eyes. His smile hardened, as if he suddenly remembered he had teeth. I don't know what you mean. Carol leaned forward and, in a low voice, said, We do. And we're going to understand all of it. The receptionist stuck her head in to ask if we needed anything, and he made a quick hand gesture, like shooing a fly away. Look, if you want us to review your cases, leave your details and we'll call you. No need to dramatize. I took a deep breath. Dramatize? Mr. Sullivan? They buried my husband and stole my pension in the same week. If you think that's theater, you'd better get ready for the second act. I saw his jaw clench, that tiny gesture that gives liars away. He stood up, walked to a metal filing cabinet, opened it, and pretended to look for something. As he did, I caught the reflection in his glass desk. His hand was shaking. At that moment, the office landline rang. He picked up impatiently. Yes, I'm busy. No, not now. I told you not to call me here. He hung up sharply and tried to compose himself, but he'd already shown too much. We left the firm with more doubts than certainties, but knowing there was fear on the other side. In the street, Carol lit another cigarette and blew out a cloud of smoke like marking territory. That man has dirt under every eyelash. And he knows who we are, Teresa said, pulling her coat tight. That gives me a bad feeling. Let him look, I replied. That way he'll know who's bees, going to push when he falls. On the way to the metro, we walked past a post office. Martha stopped dead and pointed to a poster. Do you have information about scams against pensioners? Below, a phone number. We copied it without thinking. That afternoon, I didn't go back home. I went straight to Harold's flat in 3B, that old man who did crosswords with a magnifying glass and had more filing cabinets in his living room than the finance ministry. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, with the patience of someone mentally calculating how many years in jail a tax cheat of that caliber would get. Bring me the bills, he said at last. And your friend's bank statements too. Let's see if the money followed the same path. That night, while the neighborhood turned off its lights and the bars pulled down their shutters, I was sitting at Harold's table, papers spread out like a puzzle. He moved with precision, jotting down figures, drawing lines with a pencil. Here's the trick, he murmured. This Sullivan charges an undeclared management fee, and part of that money goes into an account under a shell company. Look at the pattern. Always the same amounts, the same banks. I leaned in to see better and felt a knot in my stomach. On one of the documents, among the list of transfers, there was a name that felt unbearably familiar. Louis Martin. My husband. That must be a mistake, I said quietly. I don't think so, Harold answered. Your husband was listed as a minority partner in the company, receiving the payments. The words hung between us, heavy as lead. My husband, the man who always bragged about his integrity, was part of the scheme. I didn't know whether to get angry or laugh. So he was robbing me while he slept by my side as well, I said at last, with a calm that surprised me. Harold looked at me over his glasses and, with that dry wisdom of people who've lived too long, replied, Sometimes the dead can't rest because the living won't let them. When I stepped outside, the air was cold and a drizzle had started. I walked slowly back to my building, feeling that with every step, the story I'd told myself about my life was crumbling a bit more. I didn't have tears or rage left, just a new clarity, a sort of drive I didn't know where it came from. I climbed the stairs without turning on the light, opened the door, and found the landline flashing with a message. I listened. It was Carol's voice, urgent, almost a whisper. Evelyn, don't be scared, but I think we're being followed. A black van parked outside my house. If anything happens, keep all the papers. All of them. I froze, receiver in hand, my heart thudding like an old drum. Outside, the rain hammered at the windows insistently, and for the first time I understood that we were no longer just playing at uncovering a tax trick. We were inside something that stank of danger, and although I should have felt afraid, what I felt was a kind of calm determination, an inner voice telling me that if the dead don't rest, it's because the living still have accounts to settle. I didn't sleep that night, and not because I was scared, but because my head was spinning like an old fan. The sound of the rain blended with Harold's phrases and Carol's voice on the answering machine, and everything knotted in my throat, as if the past and the present were fighting for the same spot. Around 6, when it started to get light, I decided I couldn't just sit there waiting for things to clear up on their own, because life, if it's taught me anything, is that what you don't face rots. I got dressed in the first thing I found, shoved the papers into my handbag, and went out. The air smelled of toast and exhaust from the first buses. I went straight to the cemetery, and not out of sentimentality, but because I needed to look at that gravestone with his name on it and ask him what I hadn't had the nerve to ask while he was breathing. I walked between the graves, my heels sinking in the wet earth, and when I got to his, I stood there, silent, for a long while. "So you were in on this too, huh?" I finally said quietly. 40 years together and not a word. Very nice. I let out a bitter little laugh. Talking to Marble was silly, but it did me good, as if saying it out loud made the betrayal more real, more manageable. On the way back, I stopped at Teresa's. She opened the door in a housecoat and scarf on her head, her eyes swollen and a tremor in her voice that put me on alert. I told her about my husband, showed her the sheet with his name and the bank movements. She put a hand to her mouth and murmured, "My God, Evelyn, this goes further than we thought." She let me in, and as soon as I crossed the hallway, I caught the smell of medicine and chicken broth, that smell only homes have where health is slowly slipping away. She sat on the sofa, asked me to wait a moment, and came back with a shoebox full of envelopes. "I've been keeping things too," she said. Inside there were bills, printed emails, bank statements with official stamps. All of it pointing to the same firm, the same dates, the same amounts. But there was something else, an unopened letter with the town hall letterhead. I opened it carefully, and inside there was a notice for a non-existent debt, a tampered document. "My husband signed this shortly before he died," she explained. "They made him believe he had to regularize some payments so as not to lose the pension." Her hands were shaking as she spoke, and suddenly the cough shook her hard. I got scared, but she raised a hand, asking for silence. "Don't say anything, Evelyn. I don't want hospitals or doctors. I just want to see that man fall." I stayed with her a while, until she fell asleep, and before I left a note on the table. "You're not alone, Teresa. This is only just starting." As I stepped outside, my phone vibrated in my bag. It was Lucy. "Mum, I've been thinking. If you want, I can find you a care home near the sea, with a garden and nurses on duty 24 hours. I felt like laughing and crying at the same time. "Lucy, love, I don't need nurses. I need answers. And time." She sighed, like she was talking to a stubborn child. "Time for what?" "To fix what your father messed up." She hung up, not understanding. Sometimes I think that children, no matter how much they love us, prefer us to stay still, quiet, tidy, as if growing old were the same as giving up. On my way home, I ran into Martha, laden with shopping bags and with a strange glint in her eyes. She told me she'd seen the office assistant, that young guy with the nice face, coming out of a building in the neighborhood with an envelope in his hand. "I followed him to the bus stop," she said, lowering her voice, "and saw him hand it to a man in a suit. But it wasn't Sullivan. It was someone else." Then I felt it, that shiver that isn't fear but certainty. If the lawyer had partners, it wasn't just a small firm scam. It was a network. That same afternoon, I gathered the girls at my place. Carol arrived with a lit cigarette, Martha with the evidence, Teresa in her housecoat, coughing. I put the papers on the table, along with the ones Harold had analyzed. "It's not just Sullivan," I told them. "There are people behind him, and my husband was in it up to his neck." Teresa looked at me with a mix of compassion and alarm. "Evelyn, what if this is bigger than we can handle?" "Then we'll learn to handle it," I replied, "because there's no going back now." Carol slammed her fist on the table. "I propose something. Let's make noise. Let them know we're snooping." Martha, more cautious, added, "Before that, we have to understand everything. We need a copy of the files from that office." That's when the plan started. No heroics, just the sort of organized madness that appears when ordinary people get tired of bowing their heads. Harold showed us how to access the accounts from the office computer, as long as someone managed to plug in a USB and copy the data. "It's not that hard," he said. "If you go in as clients and distract the secretary." "I can do that," said Martha. "I still know how to talk nicely." Teresa laughed, but her cough cut it short. I handed her a tissue, and she whispered, "If I don't get better, I want you to keep going, you hear? None of this leaving it half done." I didn't know what to say. I hugged her and felt how fragile she was, her body light, as if it were slowly coming undone. I promised myself I wouldn't leave her out of anything. When they left, I stayed alone in the kitchen, looking out at the building lights and thinking about everything I didn't know. My husband, the firm, the town hall, the invisible partners. It felt like each answer opened another question, like those Russian dolls that never end. The doorbell rang. I opened it, and it was Harold, with a flask of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. "I've been checking something else," he said, walking in without asking. He opened the folder and showed me an old, yellowing document. "This is a general power of attorney your husband signed 6 years ago. It authorizes Sullivan to manage joint accounts. Your name appears on one of them." I froze. "Joint accounts? I never signed that." Harold nodded slowly. "Then they forged it." I felt a mix of fury and relief, as if I suddenly had the right to be angry, as if my outrage was no longer a whim but justice. Harold stood, put his hat on, and said, "Be careful, Evelyn. Men like him don't let go of what they steal, not even when you catch them." I watched him disappear down the hall and knew that if we wanted to go on, we'd have to move fast. I peered out the window. The black van was still there, parked under the street lamp, engine off. I didn't call Carol or the others that night. I didn't want to scare them. I sat on the sofa, handbag on my knees, the document open in my hands, and thought that maybe, for the first time in my life, I was about to do something that truly belonged to me. In the street, a cat crossed the pavement, and the van's engine started for a second, only to switch off again. And instead of shaking, I smiled, because I realized that if they were watching us, it was because we had something worth watching. 2 days went by, where everything seemed to move in slow motion, as if the neighborhood were breathing differently, as if even the dogs were sniffing the air with suspicion. Carol called early to tell me she'd seen a man hanging around near her doorway, a guy in a cap and dark jacket, and when she stared straight at him, he turned away, pretending to talk on his phone. You didn't have to be Sherlock to know we were being watched. But far from scaring us, that gave us a new kind of energy, a mix of adrenaline and pride, as if life had finally decided we were important enough to spy on. That same afternoon, we met at Martha's, whose living room was full of paintings and the stubborn smell of turpentine and strong coffee. On the table, she'd laid out canvases, brushes, and 4 glasses of water. "We're going to need disguises," she said with almost artistic seriousness, "because I'm not walking into that firm looking like this." Carol snorted, lit her cigarette, and replied, "I don't dress up to steal what's mine." Martha gave her a patient look, like a teacher who already knows the pupil will do as she pleases. "It's not a disguise, Carol, it's camouflage. We're going to blend in with Sullivan's clients. Rich women, heiresses, widows with fresh money. If they want us to look like that, we'll give them a show." Teresa, quieter, settled into an armchair with a blanket over her knees and smiled with a tired sweetness. "I was never rich, but I'd love to play the part." I looked at her and thought her voice already sounded weaker, that the illness was gaining ground, but I said nothing because her smile was firm. And sometimes the only gift you can give someone who's losing strength is pretending not to notice. Martha showed us a set of outfits she'd got from a friend who worked in a theater. Faux fur coats, fake jewelry, wigs, giant sunglasses. It looked like a carnival of conspiring pensioners. But as soon as we put the coats on, things changed. In the mirror, I saw 4 different women, more confident, more dangerous. There was something liberating in that parody of luxury, a quiet revenge against everything we'd been told we couldn't be. While we laughed, trying on wigs, Harold arrived with his notebook under his arm. "I've checked the movements of the Swiss account," he announced, and I found a trail leading to a shell company in Manchester. If we get a full copy of the firm's files, I can follow it. I explained Martha's plan, and instead of being shocked, he smiled like a grandfather watching his granddaughters stage a dangerous play. Just make sure the USB is well hidden. And if they catch you, do what politicians always do: deny everything. The day came with a pale sky and that winter smell that makes everything seem more serious. We dressed at Martha's, helping each other with the wigs and brooches, and when we looked in the mirror, we couldn't help laughing. Teresa looked like a tired duchess, Carol like a retired actress, Martha like an eccentric artist, and I looked like the vengeful version of myself. The firm welcomed us with the same cold elegance as always, but the receptionist didn't recognize us. Martha spoke first, with a polite voice and advert smile. "Good afternoon. We're from the St. Damien Foundation. We'd like to invest a small fortune in you. Stable funds. And we've been highly recommended to Mr. Sullivan." The girl smiled at once. Banks can smell money even when it's in costume. She took us into the main room, and Sullivan appeared shortly after. Impeccable. Same suit, same shark smile smelling blood. "Ladies, what a pleasure to meet you. May I offer you something?" Carol looked him up and down and said, "Just justice, but let's start with coffee." He didn't catch the irony. While we talked, Martha filled in a form he'd given her. Her fingers moved with deliberate slowness. I, taking advantage of the secretary's absence, opened my bag and took out the USB wrapped in a handkerchief. I got up, pretending to look for the bathroom, and slipped down a side corridor. I found a secondary office with a computer on. My hands were shaking, but I managed to plug in the USB and copy everything in the folder, Old Clients. It took forever. Each minute felt like a year. Suddenly I heard footsteps. I closed the file and pretended to be on the phone. It was Louis, the office assistant, the young man with kind eyes. He looked at me in surprise. "Are you lost, ma'am?" he asked. "Just looking for the bathroom, son. These offices are a maze." He smiled and pointed to the door at the end of the hallway. "That way, but be careful. Not all paths lead to the bathroom." I went back to the meeting room with my heart racing. Teresa made a subtle gesture, touching her ear, and I knew something was wrong. Sullivan had taken a call and was watching us with a new focus, as if something didn't quite add up. Martha closed the folder, stood up and said, "We appreciate your time, Mr. Sullivan. We'd like to think about our decision and come back with a concrete proposal." He gave a slight nod, though his eyes locked on mine with a cold glint. "Of course, whenever you like. And remember, in my office, nothing gets lost." We walked out slowly, smiling, as if it had all been a normal meeting. When we turned the corner, Carol said, "That bastard knows." "He suspects," I corrected, "but he still has no proof." We went straight to Harold's. I handed him the USB. He plugged it into his computer with trembling hands. On the screen appeared folders full of names and account numbers. Hundreds. It was like opening a box of snakes. "This is bigger than we thought," he murmured. Suddenly he stopped. "There's something strange here." He opened a document, a list of partners, and among them, once again, my husband's name. But there was another detail. Next to his, there was the name of a town councillor. Harold looked at me and said gravely, "They're mixed up with politics, Evelyn. This isn't just an office scam, it's institutional corruption." My heart sank. At that moment, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Stop digging. You don't know who you're messing with." I showed it to the others. Carol jumped to her feet, eyes blazing. "Well, now they have no idea who they've messed with." Teresa gave a weak laugh, coughing, and said, "If I die, I want you to bury me with that USB." No one answered. Outside, dusk fell, and the neighborhood lights came on. I stood up, put the USB in my bag, and looked at my friends one by one. "There's no turning back," I said. "And let there not be." As we left, Martha touched my arm and whispered, "Evelyn, that young guy, Louis, looked at you strangely. I don't think he's on their side." I looked at her, surprised. On ours, then? She smiled faintly. I don't know, but his eyes were sad. The guilty don't have eyes like that. And for the first time in weeks, I felt maybe, in all that filth, there was someone else willing to help us, even if it was from the inside. The next morning, when the smell of damp still hung from the day before, the doorbell rang insistently, and for a moment I thought it might be Carol with some new plan, or Martha with another crazy idea. But when I opened it, I found Louis, the office boy, shirt soaked and eyes red from not sleeping. Before I could say anything, he stepped inside without asking, stood in the middle of the living room and said, I know what you're doing, and you have to stop. His voice didn't sound threatening. It sounded exhausted, like someone who's carried a lie too long. I stared at him, waiting for the rest. I didn't come to expose you, he added quickly. I came because I want to help. My mother was one of Sullivan's victims. When she found out, it was too late. She took her own life, and he kept collecting as if nothing had happened. I was speechless. The air in the room felt thicker, and for the first time I saw that boy without the office uniform. I saw a broken son, someone just as fed up as we were. And why now? I asked him, and he answered without hesitating. Because you've done what I couldn't. Face him. I poured him a coffee as he opened a folder he'd brought under his arm. Inside were printed emails, transfer lists, and a page with the town hall letterhead. Here's the link, he explained, pointing at the names with a slightly shaking finger. Sullivan doesn't act alone. He has a deal with a municipal fund to funnel part of the diverted pensions into private investments. Half that money disappears before it touches a public account. And the rest? The rest goes to Switzerland. Carol arrived just then, unannounced, and when she saw the boy in my house, she nearly had a heart attack. And who's this? Another one of their lawyers? She snapped, half joking, half defensive. Louis stood up slowly, raising his hands as if walking into a police station. Calm down, ma'am. I'm on your side. She looked at him suspiciously, smelled his fear, and finally muttered, We'll see how long your courage lasts. We spent the afternoon going through the documents. Martha joined us later, with a flask of coffee and her glasses hanging from her neck, and Teresa, from her bed, spoke to us on speakerphone. The poor thing could barely breathe, but her voice still had that spark that doesn't go out even with exhaustion. If that boy is telling the truth, we need to move now, she said between coughs and sighs. Don't wait for them to come to you. Louis nodded. We can do it this week. I have remote access to the firm's server. If you give me the USB, I can pull everything and send it to a journalist I know. But I need time, and I need protection. Carol let out a dry laugh. Protection, he says. The only thing we have is our age, and believe me, at our age killing a widow doesn't look good in the press. I nudged her, because even if she was right, there was no need to scare the boy more than he already was. We agreed that he'd handle the technical side while we kept up appearances. Keep going to the bar, stick to your routines. Make them think you're not suspicious, he advised. And as he left, he looked at me with a strange mixture of respect and fear. Evelyn, if anything happens to me, don't erase my name. Let it be known. He awkwardly touched my shoulder and left in the rain. That night I didn't switch on the TV. I sat watching the lights of the building opposite, thinking that what had started as a widow's tantrum had turned into something bigger, something we couldn't drop without it crushing us. At 10, Lucy called. Mum, you've been acting strange. Is something going on? I bit my lip before answering. What's going on is I've discovered your father wasn't the saint we thought. There was a long silence, then she said quietly, Then it was all true. I got a letter from the bank too, something about old transactions, but I thought it was a mistake. I asked her to show it to me. I can't now. I tore it up. I didn't want any trouble. I closed, my eyes a moment. Problems don't tear, Lucy. They get inherited. I hung up without anger, feeling that calm resignation that looks a lot like bravery. I went to the window, looked at the street, and the black van was gone. For a second, I thought they'd moved on. But turning my head, I saw a different car parked outside the building, smaller, lights off. I learned that silence also keeps watch. The next day, we met at Teresa's. She was weaker, but she refused to cancel. Harold brought an old radio to distract her, but she only wanted to talk about the plan. Louis arrived later, soaked once again, with a trembling smile. I did it. I got into the system, but someone else has too. There are strange movements, deleted files, traces of another access. We all looked at each other. Martha was the first to ask, "Do you think they found us out?" Louis shook his head. "No, not yet. But they're scrubbing everything. If we don't do something this week, the evidence will disappear." Teresa shifted on the armchair, breathing heavily. "Then don't wait. Do it today. And if you can't, burn it all." No one dared contradict her. Louis promised to do it that very night. Before leaving, he gave me an envelope. "If something goes wrong, keep this safe." I didn't want to open it in front of the others. I put it in my handbag like someone keeping a bomb. At dusk, Teresa fell asleep mid-conversation. Martha tucked her in gently, and Carol, for the first time in her life, stubbed out her cigarette without complaining. "I don't like how she's breathing," she said softly. No one answered. The next morning, when the phone rang, I knew what it was before I picked up. It was Teresa's niece. She had a very bad night. She didn't wake up. I stayed silent, listening to the hum in the receiver. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just felt that a part of our push, of that voice that reminded us why we were doing all this, had gone. Martha came to my place with swollen eyes and a note in her hand. "This was on her table," she said. The note was in Teresa's shaky handwriting. "If I don't make it, don't stop. They've already taken too much from us for us to stay still on top of it." We hugged, the three of us, without saying a word. Outside, the sky felt like lead, and in that heavy silence my phone rang again. An unknown number. I answered. A cold, metallic, emotionless voice said, "You already have one casualty. Don't look for the next." I don't know how long I stood there, phone in hand, but when I finally hung up and looked at Carol, her eyes were blazing and the cigarette was already between her lips. "Then they'd better get ready," she muttered, "because they don't know what an angry widow is." And then, without needing to say it out loud, we knew morning would have to wait. That very night, we'd go out again, not for revenge or fear, but because you can't kill what has nothing left to lose. Teresa's funeral was modest, intimate, with no priests or long speeches, just as she wanted, with the usual wilted flowers and a group of old friends talking more about recipes than death. I didn't want to stay long because everything sounded false, even the condolences. Carol, her eyes hidden behind sunglasses, muttered, "At least she's resting now," and Martha elbowed her. More than sadness, what I felt was an old rage, the kind that simmers slowly. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I looked at the coffin and thought that if Teresa hadn't been so scared at the beginning, maybe she'd still be alive. But then I realized that, deep down, she'd died the way she'd lived, without complaining much, with decency, and with a plan half finished. When it was over, the three of us went up to the hearse. Martha held a folded envelope she'd found in Teresa's coat pocket. She handed it to me without a word. Inside was a short, handwritten note. Account number 55643Z. Don't trust the police. The inspector is not neutral. The handwriting was weak, but unmistakable. I slipped the paper into my bag as if it were an inheritance. That same afternoon, while Martha made coffee and Carol swore revenge between puffs of smoke, the doorbell rang. It was Inspector Vaughn. A tall woman, serious face, the kind of voice that doesn't need to be raised to make everyone listen. "Mrs. Martin, we need to talk," she said, and didn't wait for an invitation to come in. She carried a briefcase and that look of someone who already knows more than she says. We sat in the living room, and she started with that polite tone people use when they interrogate without seeming to. "I know you and others have been investigating the Sullivan case on your own. What you're doing is dangerous and also illegal." I let her talk without interrupting. When she finished, I served her a coffee and replied, "Is it illegal to look for what they stole from you? Then put me on the list, Inspector." She sighed. "Don't misunderstand me, Mrs. Martin. I'm on your side, but if you keep this up, you'll end up in jail or worse." Carol laughed, a hollow laugh. "At our age, worse than jail is oblivion, and we're already there." The inspector looked at her with a mix of annoyance and respect. I took Teresa's note from my bag and laid it in front of her. "Does this account look familiar?" She looked at it for a second, barely blinked, and pushed it back to me. "I don't know what you're talking about." That coldness was enough to confirm what I already suspected. Teresa was right. The inspector wasn't neutral. When she left, the air in the room was thick. Martha was pale. "Evelyn, if the police are in on this, who do we go to?" Carol answered without hesitation. "No one. We're in it up to our necks, and what Teresa started is not getting buried with her." Louis came at dusk, pale, with a sheet of paper in his hand. "I can't stay long. I found something else," he said. On the table he spread a copy of a transfer order. "The pension money is moved through a municipal investment fund, and the signatory is Councillor Reeves. Sullivan is just the front." We stared, not breathing. Carol slammed her palm on the table. "Then we have to go after that councillor. If the big fish chokes, the others go down with him." Louis shook his head. "It's not that simple. Reeves has protection, and now the police know you're involved." Martha, calm as ever, asked if he'd managed to send the info to the journalist. "No," they intercepted the email. "Someone inside the paper is bought. Everything's blocked." We stayed quiet for a while. Outside it started raining again. I thought of Teresa, of her cough, of her hands writing that note in secret. Then I spoke slowly, knowing what I was about to say would change everything. "If the journalists can't, we'll do it, ourselves. We're going to record him. Let his voice, his tricks, his lies be heard. If Sullivan admits one sentence, we put it out there and let him drown in his own words." Louis looked at me in disbelief. "And how do you plan to make him confess?" I met his gaze. "By making him believe we can still be his clients. Or better, his partners." Carol let out a dry cackle. "Now that will be some serious theater." That night we set up the plan. Martha hid a tiny microphone inside a costume jewelry brooch. Harold, who'd heard part of the conversation from his balcony, offered to keep watch from the street with an old walkie-talkie. And Carol, as always, took charge of the riskiest part, getting an appointment with Sullivan. "I'll tell him I have a friend with a millionaire inheritance who wants to invest." When Carol hung up, we looked at each other and knew there was no turning back. It wasn't just revenge, it was the need to close the wound. The next morning we went to the office. Sullivan greeted us with the same smile, though his eyes no longer belonged to a confident lawyer. There was something nervous in his gestures, a little twitch at the corner of his mouth. Carol started talking about the supposed inheritance, and I pretended to take notes, recording every word. Martha, from the armchair, watched every move, looking for a crack. Halfway through the conversation, Sullivan's phone rang. He answered with a, "Yes, I'm with them," that froze us. When he hung up, he smiled. "Sorry, internal matters." I don't know if it was instinct or fear, but at that moment I said something I hadn't planned at all. And was Mrs. Teresa Malone an internal matter too? His smile vanished. He stared at me. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do," I replied, not looking away. "And you also know there are people dead because of you." Martha touched my arm discreetly, a signal to be quiet. But it was too late. Sullivan stood up slowly, walked around the desk and leaned over me. "You have a lot of nerve speaking like that. I'd recommend you keep it, because nerve is sometimes very expensive." We left without looking back. Outside, Inspector Vaughn was leaning against her car, smoking. We exchanged a brief glance. She said nothing, but her being there, right then, confirmed that the net was tightening. That night, Harold came round with a bottle of cheap wine and a tired look. "I heard something on the radio," he said. Councillor Reeves is under investigation for corruption. Someone leaked town hall documents. I looked at him, surprised. Lewis? Harold shrugged. Don't know. But the storm has started. Carol smiled for the first time in days. Then we just have to push a bit more. When I was alone, I opened my bag and took out the brooch. Inside, the recording still held Sullivan's words, his veiled threat, his nerves. I played it once, slowly, listening, to every breath. And at the end, in his tone, I heard something I wasn't expecting. Fear. I turned it off, hid it under the tablecloth, and thought of Teresa. Rest easy, I murmured. We're still on it. Outside, the rain hammered the windows like applause. The city woke up with that metallic smell days before a storm have, and I, who could no longer tell if it was fear or exhaustion making my hands shake, spent the morning staring out the window, as if someone on the other side of the glass was going to give us permission to act. Carol arrived in her soaked coat with a flask of strong coffee, dropped her handbag on the floor, and said straight out that Lewis had disappeared. He doesn't answer his phone. He's not at his flat. And the neighbor says she heard footsteps last night and a door slamming in a rush. Martha sat down, lit a candle like a spell, and murmured, If they took him, it's because he did the right thing. I switched on Harold's old radio, the one he'd left us, so we'd stay connected. And all we got was static. Everything sounded strange, as if the world had shifted a centimeter and no one had noticed. Harold came down shortly after, in his wool jacket with his notebook under his arm, and told us he'd been following the news and that Councillor Reeves was still under investigation. But Sullivan hadn't yet been named publicly. He's protected, he said. Either someone high up is holding him up, or he's bought half the world. Carol cut him off with a snort. Then we'll charge him with the only thing that can't be bought. Shame. By then, we already knew what we had to do. We didn't say it out loud, but it was clear. We had the recording, the documents, the Swiss account, and a video of Teresa, the one she'd left on her computer and that Harold had managed to recover. In it, she spoke with a painful calm, telling everything from the start, with dates and names, and ending with a sentence that pierced me. If you're listening to this, it's because I'm no longer here, and if I'm no longer here, all the more reason to go on. We decided to do it that night. Martha prepared everything with almost ritual care, hid the USB sticks in a biscuit tin, wrapped the microphones in tape, and kept the keys to her late husband's car. Carol brought 3 torches, an iron bar, just in case, and a pack of chewing gum, because in her opinion, all important operations are done with something in your mouth. I slipped the brooch with the recording into the inside pocket of my coat and Teresa's envelope into my bag. I didn't know if it was strategy or because I felt she had to come with us. We went out at 10. The streets were almost empty, streetlights casting that yellow tone that makes everything look older. Harold stayed at the doorway with the walkie-talkie. If you're not back by midnight, I'll call my cousin at the radio, the one who hasn't sold out yet, he said, half joking, half serious. The firm's building was deserted. The corridor lights were off, the main door double-locked. Martha pulled out a hairpin, and with a skill I didn't know she had, picked the lock. I learned this in the 70s, when being a free woman was almost a crime, she murmured. Inside it smelled of paper, fresh cleaning products, and something else, that expensive perfume of Sullivan's mixed with carpet dust and fear. We went up the stairs without a word, our heels muffled by the carpet. Carol stayed at the entrance, on watch, while Martha and I slipped into the main office. I turned on the torch and pointed it at the desk. Everything was tidy, too tidy. Papers perfectly aligned, drawers empty. He's cleaned up, I said. He knew we were coming. Martha, standing by the computer, shook her head. No, he wants us to think that. Look at this. On the screen, a file was open. Old client's final review. We copied, everything in silence, our hands damp, hearts pounding. Outside, a distant rumble of thunder. Suddenly, Carol whistled from the hall, a signal. We rushed out and found her by the window. A black van, she said, the same one from weeks ago. We had no time to hide. The building door burst open, and 2 men came in, dark suits, closed umbrellas, stone faces. They looked at us without surprise, as if they already knew our names, ages, and sins. One of them said, "Mr. Sullivan is expecting you." Carol stepped forward first, cigarette between her lips, no fear. "Then tell him he doesn't have an appointment." The taller one gestured, and before we could react, a familiar voice echoed from the far corridor. "Let them in. We don't want a scene." It was him, Sullivan, without his tie, face paler than I remembered, like he'd gone days without sleeping. "You have no idea what mess you've walked into," he said, folding his arms. "I'm not the one you're fighting." "We don't care who," I replied. "We've already buried one friend because of you, and we're not burying our silence too." Martha stepped forward, took off the brooch and placed it on the table. "In case you forget your own words." He looked at it, understood, and smiled a tired little smile. "So you recorded me. Very good. Then you already know that if this comes out, I won't be the only one to fall. Half the town hall, 3 banks, and you yourselves go down with me." I took a step forward. "Then let everything fall. We're used to having things collapse on us." I don't know if it was my tone or his exhaustion, but for a second I saw a flicker of defeat in his eyes. Then he turned to the men and muttered something. They left without a word. When the door closed, Sullivan poured himself a whiskey, drank, and spoke without looking at us. "You want justice? It doesn't exist. What there is balance. If you let me go, the money will appear where it should. If you sink me, everything disappears." Martha walked over slowly, placed her hands on the table, and looked him straight in the eye. "And what makes you think we believe in balances anymore?" I took out the USB and left it next to the glass. "Here is your ruin. You decide whether to make it public or have us erase you." He took it, looked at it, and in a desperate gesture hurled it to the floor and stamped on it. The plastic snapped. Carol shouted an insult. Martha rushed to pick up the pieces, and I, without thinking, reached into my bag and pulled out the other one, the real one, the one I'd kept from the start. "Break as many as you like," I said, "but you can't go up against a dead woman's copy. She's not around to be afraid anymore." Sullivan stared at me, not understanding. "Teresa?" I murmured. "She recorded too." It was the first time I saw him tremble. He slumped into his chair and covered his face with his hands. "You don't understand. This didn't start with me." His voice cracked, and for a moment I saw him as human, not a monster, but a man crushed by the system he'd built. There were no more words. We walked out slowly, leaving the office in the half-dark. Outside, the storm finally broke, rain pouring down, washing the streets in the fear. When we got to the car, Martha started the engine with shaking hands, and Carol, checking the mirror, murmured, "We're not done, are we?" I shook my head. "No. This ends when everyone knows what we did." And as the car rolled through the rain, I felt that for the first time, the city belonged to us a little bit, even if only for that night. I don't know if it was the storm or the built-up tension, but that night I slept little and badly, my head noisy, my hands burning as if I were still clutching the USB. The next morning the neighborhood smelled of washed dirt and diesel, and when I went down for bread, I felt something different in the air, a mix of nerves and expectation. On the corner, the newsagent had a pile of papers and a nervous smile. "Have you seen the news, Evelyn? About the counselor? The pension fund?" A bomb. I grabbed a copy and opened it right there on the pavement, my fingers damp from the rain. The front page showed a photo of Reeves, the counselor, escorted by police. "Corruption and diversion of public funds. Investigation opened," said the headline. They didn't name Sullivan, or my husband, or anyone else, but below, in smaller letters, it mentioned an anonymous leak from unofficial sources. I knew it was Lewis. I ran upstairs and called Carol. She answered hoarsely. "I've seen it. It's everywhere. If Lewis is alive, he must be hiding right now." I pictured the boy, alone, exhausted, watching the same news from some cheap boarding house. We didn't know if we should be happy or scared. Martha arrived soon after, drenched and breathless. "Don't turn the TV off," she said. They're going to mention it again. And there, between detergent ads and a pointless debate about bread prices, came the image of Sullivan walking into his office, surrounded by cameras. No handcuffs, just flashes and a rehearsed smile. The lawyer denies the accusations and claims to be the victim of a smear campaign, the presenter announced in her elegant funeral tone. Carol dropped into the sofa with a bitter laugh. It started. The powerful never fall. They just change their office. But Martha wasn't listening. Look closely, she said, pointing at the screen. For a second, just before they cut away, you could see Inspector Vaughn behind Sullivan, whispering in his ear. It was a blink, but enough to see it clearly. She's protecting him, I murmured. Or pushing from the inside, Martha added, though she didn't sound convinced. We decided not to move that day. Not out of fear, but instinct. Harold came up later with a conspiratorial expression. A friend at the radio called. They say there are more names in the leaked documents. The full list is coming out tomorrow. I asked him to get me a microphone, an old recorder, something. What for? He asked. Because if this goes south, I want my version on record. That afternoon the phone rang. It was Lucy. Mum, I just saw the news. Do you have anything to do with this? Her voice was afraid, but also incredulous. I have everything to do with it. Love, I said slowly. And if I keep quiet, I'll be guilty too. On the other end there was a long silence. You're crossing a line, Mum. No, Lucy. I'm getting back to where I should have been all along, on the side of the ones who don't shut up. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I stared at the receiver for a good while, knowing I might have just lost my daughter for the second time, but also knowing I couldn't go back. At dusk, someone rang the doorbell. It was Inspector Vaughn. She wasn't in uniform, her face more tired than last time. I could arrest you right now, she said as she stepped inside, but I'm not going to. Sullivan is about to flee the country. He has a ticket for tonight. I stood still, waiting for the trap, but she went on. Don't think I'm good, I'm not. I just want this over before it takes all of us down. She handed me a sheet, a copy of the formal complaint against the firm. Here's your signature, Mrs. Martin. Forged. If this comes out, they'll blame you too. I laughed. A dry laugh even I didn't expect. Let them. They've already blamed me for everything, for surviving, for thinking, for not dying on time. The inspector lowered her eyes. Your friend was right about me. But she was wrong too. There are things I can't stop either. When she left, Carol looked at me from the doorway. Do you realize? They want to use us as scapegoats. They won't if we speak first, I answered. And then I knew. The newspapers weren't enough. Teresa's voice had to be heard, and ours too. Martha put the video together that same night. She used Teresa's recorded will, Sullivan's thinly veiled threat, and a fragment of my own voice telling what we'd lived. Harold edited it all with his clumsy hands and endless patience. We'll upload it first thing, before they delete anything, he said. If this shit is going to hit the fan, let it at least smell of truth. The video went online at dawn. In less than an hour, social media was on fire. Neighborhood widows uncover pensions, corruption. The posthumous testimony of Teresa Malone. The pensions lawyer hides. The headlines multiplied. And suddenly, the old ladies at the market greeted us with a new respect. Mid-morning, cameras arrived in the neighborhood. Young journalists, with microphones and hurry, looking for the protagonists. Carol, who never backs down, went out to the minest doorway with her cigarette lit and told them, not protagonists, survivors. The protagonists take the money. We pay for the ticket. Martha and I watched from the window, and for a moment I felt something like relief, though I didn't know if it was real or just exhaustion. Do you think it will make a difference? She asked. I don't know, I replied, but at least the world will know we exist. At noon, a dark car stopped at the building. Louis got out. He was gaunt, with a cut on his eyebrow and wrinkled clothes. He had an envelope in his hand. I don't have much time, he said as he came up. Sullivan is fleeing. But before he left, he came to me. Said if we let him go, He'd put the money where it should be. I didn't believe him. He handed me the envelope. Inside, there was a postcard from Geneva and a figure written by hand. The money's been transferred. Everything he stole. It's in the account Teresa left, in her name. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Carol hugged him like a son, and Martha, with tears in her eyes, said, "Teresa won." Louis nodded, with a mix of sadness and relief. She didn't do it alone. When he left, I stood for a while looking at the postcard. Outside, the noise of journalists mixed with car horns. On TV, the day's news was still the pension scandal, and for the first time, the face of an older woman was on screen without being an anonymous victim. Carol poured herself some wine, passed me the glass, and toasted silently. "To Teresa," she said. Martha added, "And to us, still standing." I drank slowly, feeling the warmth of the wine in my throat, and looking out the window, I thought the storm had passed. Yes, but it had left everything changed. Fear no longer had anywhere to hide. And even though we still didn't know if the next day they'd come to arrest us, to congratulate us, or to forget us, I knew the silence had been broken for good. Teresa had won, and, with her, all of us who'd ever been invisible. There was no calm sunrise. That last morning, the whole neighborhood smelled of nerves and reheated coffee, and the neighbors leaned out of their windows as if they were waiting for a parade. When I went down, the newsagent held up the paper with that half-smile of someone who already knows what's inside. "Lawyer Sullivan arrested at Heathrow Airport while trying to flee the country," said the headline. The photo was blurry, but it was him in handcuffs, dazed look, crumpled suit, swarmed by flashes. In the bottom corner, a small subtitle, "The case's whistleblowers, a group of widows from London, reveal the scheme." Carol caught up with me on the corner, hair tied back and a scarf that looked like a flag. "Told you, in the end the bastard falls," she said, walking without stopping, with that mix of pride and melancholy that had become her way of breathing. Martha was waiting in front of the bakery, phone in hand, and, eyes wet. Louis texted me. "He's okay. They got him out of the country last night. The money's frozen until the stolen pensions are paid back. All legal, all clean." The three of us stood there in silence, as if there was suddenly too much noise around us. Cars passed, kids went to school, the baker waved, and we, in the middle of all that, were still there, standing, not quite sure what to do with victory. We went to Manny's bar, because endings, even unexpected ones, need coffee and witnesses. Manny hugged us one by one, with that clumsy affection of a man who can't say congratulations without offering food. "You're famous," he said, laughing, and put 3 coffees on the counter. "Journalists were already asking about you. I told them you're the same as always, just more dangerous." Carol laughed, Martha sighed, and I stared at the steam rising from my cup. "Do you realize?" I said quietly. "It all started with a bill and a funeral, and now we're here, with the whole country talking about us." Carol glanced sideways at me. "Let them talk. Better that than being dead in silence." Suddenly the bar TV changed channel. On the news, a young presenter talked about the courage of a group of older women who uncovered a multi-million corruption network. Then they showed Teresa's video, her calm voice, her direct gaze into the camera. There was no music, no effects, no sensationalist captions, just her voice saying, "I don't want divine or political justice. I just want our dignity back." No one in the bar spoke during those minutes. Even Manny, who never shuts up, stood still. When it ended, ads came back on, but the silence stayed hanging a little longer. Martha wiped her eyes discreetly. Carol lit a cigarette and muttered, "The woman sure knew how to talk." Inside me, I felt something that wasn't sadness or pride. It was a kind of old relief, as if I'd finally dropped a stone I'd been carrying in my chest for years. I turned to the other 2 and said, "We have to go see her." We went to the cemetery together, without telling anyone, with the bunch of daisies Martha always brought out of habit. The path was full of dry leaves and a cold wind that reminded you were still alive. We reached her simple grave, with her name, the dates, and one sentence engraved, Nothing ends here. Carol laid the flowers down. Martha rested her hand on the stone, and I crouched slowly. "It's done now, Teresa," I whispered. "They didn't take your name." Everyone heard it. The wind picked up a bit, as if answering. On the way back, the neighborhood felt different. People greeted us. Neighbors who used to avoid talking now came over to thank us. A kid from the building opposite asked for a photo for his grandma. Martha, who never knew how to pose, burst out laughing. "If this ends up online, I'll die a second time." That afternoon, as the sun sank and shadows stretched across the facades, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea and the radio on. Harold was speaking on a local program, his deep, retired accountant voice saying, "They called them crazy, nosy, drama queens. But thanks to them, one of the biggest frauds in the country was uncovered. They're not heroines, they're citizens tired of being treated as invisible." I closed my eyes, listening to his voice mingling with the traffic hum. For the first time in a long while, the city's noise didn't bother me. I thought of Lucy, of whether she'd be watching the news, of whether she'd finally understand why I did what I did. Almost as if in answer, the phone rang. It was her. Her voice sounded different, slower, softer. "Mum, I saw everything. You were right." I stayed quiet, letting the silence speak for me. Then I said, without overthinking, "Come by tomorrow, I'll make coffee. I don't have secrets anymore, just stories." She laughed, and that laugh was the closest thing to peace I'd felt in months. When I hung up, the sky was glowing with the last colors of sunset. Carol shouted from her window that Manny was buying drinks for the furious widows, and Martha appeared behind her curtains, laughing. And I, for the first time since it all started, allowed myself a real smile. I looked towards the horizon, took a deep breath and thought of Teresa, of Louis, of Harold, of all those who left without seeing the end, and of those who would come after, anywhere in the world, making noise where before there was only resignation. The story was no longer mine or ours. It belonged to all of us. And that was enough. So I stayed there, watching the sun slowly slip behind the buildings, the warm air on my face, and a quiet certainty in my chest that even if everything changes and time erases the names, there will always be a woman ready to say, "Enough," and light the spark again. And that's how it all ended, or rather, how it really began. Because you learn late that life doesn't retire, it reinvents itself. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening, for staying with me through every silence, every blow, and every laugh. I'd love to know what you think about all this. What would you have done in my place? Where are you listening from? Tell me in the comments. I promise I'll read them one by one with my coffee in hand. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this, one real, imperfect, and with the heart raw, subscribe. Because what's coming next, you won't want to miss it.